Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this segment. Today we'll be looking at the tort of strict liability, Violence versus Fletcher. So, what is strict liability? First of all, we're going to define what strict liability is according to the case of Violence versus Fletcher, 1868. So, what was defined was that a person, for his own purpose, brings on his land or collects or keeps there anything likely to do mischief. If it escapes, must keep it at his own peril. If he does not do so, he is prima facie answerable for all the damage which is the natural consequence of its escape. So we'll see the elements as we break them down in the next slide. So when the defendant brings something on the land or keeps something on their land, so we're going to look at the first element, bringing on the land or keeping. That's the first element of strict liability. So we're going to start off by establishing the first element. So we'll look at the case of Giles versus Walker. What had transpired in the case was that the defendant had not brought these seeds, these plants, and these plants that produce seeds that produce seeds that flew into the claimant's land and destroyed the claimant's plants and crops and everything. So in this case, the defendant was not liable for the damage that was caused by these plants because he did not initially bring these plants on his land. They just happened to have grown it on the land and they just flew into the claimant's land. They blew by the wind blew them in the claimant's land. So we can say that in this case of Giles versus Walker, the defendant was not liable for any for bringing any plants that would damage the claimant's crops. So that's what we can say about the first element. So before we move on to the next element, it's important to note that in the tort of nuisance, when someone brings something on their land and it causes mischief or it just damages the claimant's property or anything like that, they can bring a claim in the tort of nuisance. So we can, that's the very important point we should note. Even as we study, we should put that in our minds. So it's the first element as well in the tort of Violence versus Fletcher. So before we move to the next slide, let's have a quick summary of what we have established in the first element. So in the first element, we have established that the defendant must bring something that naturally escapes on their land. So if it is unnatural, then they will not be liable. So let's go to the next element. Something likely to cause damage if it escapes. So anything dangerous in certain circumstances can cause mischief or cause damage in the plaintiff's land. So even water itself, for example, can also be one of the things that can cause damage to the claimant's property or anything that belongs to the claimant. So we look at the case of Violence versus Fletcher, where the defendant had built a water reservoir that caused damage to the defendant's mines. So what he had built was that he built a water reservoir that kept water, and then the water somehow found itself in the defendant's mines, and therefore we can say that he was held liable in the tort of Violence versus Fletcher because he had kept something on their land, and then the same thing had finally escaped and caused damage to the claimant's mine. So we can go to the next element. So before we go to the next element, let's first have a brief recap of what we've learned in this slide. So basically, what we've learned in this slide is that if the defendant brings something likely to cause mischief or damage and it escapes, they'll be liable in the tort of Violence versus Fletcher. So let's move to the next slide. So, in order to also establish whether the defendant can be liable in the rule of Rylance versus Fletcher, it's important to note that we are supposed to establish this element of reasonable foreseeability of damages. So, this same element can be found in numerous torts, including the tort of negligence. So, this can also be found in the rule of Rylance versus Fletcher. So, the defendant must reasonably foresee the damage that occurs to the claimant. So if there is no reasonable foreseeability, that means the defendant can't be liable in the tort of Rylance versus Fletcher. So what happened? There's a case of Cambridge Water versus Eastern Counties Leather. So what happened in this case was that the defendant spilled small chemicals in their property that likely managed to fall into the water that was going to the claimant's borehole. So it was held that the defendant was not liable because the damages were too remote in that case. They were just too remote because he couldn't reasonably foresee the chemicals spillage to find themselves in the defendant's borehole because it was so far away, so the damages were too remote. So we move on to the next element. So what we've learned in this slide is that reasonable foreseeability of damages is a very important element in the rule of Rylance versus Fletcher strict liability. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide. So this slide talks about an escape. So when someone keeps something that's likely to cause mischief and that thing was reasonably foreseen, then that thing escapes, then they can be held liable in the rule of Rylance versus Fletcher. So we look at the escape. We can look at Rylance versus Fletcher itself, where the defendant's water reservoir led the water to escape into the claimant's land and cause damages. So we move to the next slide. So the next element talks about the defendant's use must be non-natural use. So when the defendant brings something on their land, it must be in order for the defendant to be held liable in the rule of Rylance versus Fletcher, they must bring something that is non-natural use on their land. It doesn't have to be naturally used on the land, but for non-natural use purposes. So we can look at the case of Transco versus Stockport. We can look at the case of Transco versus Stockport. So the case of Transco versus Stockport, what happened was that the claimant owned gas pipes that went beneath the surface of a railway between Stockport and Denton. Stockport was responsible for the water pipe supplying water to a block of flats in the nearby estates. A leak developed in the pipe, which went undetected for some time. The water saturated and embarked where Transco's gas pipes were located. Due to the saturation, the embankment collapsed, leaving Transco pipe unsupported and posing a serious risk. So the issue was that the question was whether the rule of Rylance versus Fletcher could be applied. And then what was held in the case was that the court ruled that the council was not liable for the damage because the council was using the land for a natural use, so they were not liable in the tort of Rylance versus Fletcher because they are using their land for natural use. So we can go to the next slide. Before we do that, we can have a brief explanation on this element. So here we can see in the case of Transco versus Stockport that the defendants were using the land for natural use. So if in an event where they were using the land for non-natural use, they will be liable in the tort of Rylance versus Fletcher. So the council in this case were using the land for natural use. So let's go to the next slide. And oh wow, it's the end. So thank you for listening. You can check more on my website where I'll post more case summaries and other stuff that are relevant. But one thing I forgot to mention was that um, the defenses in the Tort of Rowlands versus Fletcher, but you can look at them on your own. You can do your research. You can read them online. But that's what you have to know in the case of Rowlands versus Fletcher. Just that. Because once you know all these things, then you are set and you're ready to write your exams, and you'll be ready to write your tests or your assignments and everything else. This is just a short recap and a summary of strict liability, Rowlands versus Fletcher. Thank you for watching and have a blessed year.